As an art form, video games have arguably evolved exponentially. From Atari's simplistic tennis simulator Pong in the 1970s to the latest console generations capable of creating fully realised 3D worlds, in many respects they have come a long way. However, some would argue that in other ways, video games have lagged behind other mass media counterparts like film, television and books. As capable of creating realistic worlds and telling stories as they've become, it is of no surprise to anyone that video games are not the most inclusive medium. For years, female gamers have fought to be equally represented in games and among the community, and although they have come a long way, there is still plenty of misrepresentation and bias. However, the group we'll be focusing on is the LGBT community. As far as inclusion goes, older games featuring LGBT characters tended to focus on tired stereotypes, as well as creating some strange stereotypes of their own. These characters are often made light of. Even newer games do this, or rarely include these characters to begin with. That is why we must ask, have video games really evolved that much in terms of maturity in dealing with such an important social issue? LGBT representation in video games goes back to around a decade after the focus on the industry began, with 1986's Moon Mist giving the first example of a lesbian character in a video game. There are a fair few examples of LGBT representation after this point in video game history, even from some of gaming's biggest franchises such as Super Mario and Final Fantasy. However, many of these portrayals have extreme issues, and more often than not seem to paint LGBT people in a bad light.
Villain, 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 villain and out of his mind order. And finally, the Magypsies, not villains, but also not human. Speaking of inhuman, Banjo-Tooie also has a crossdresser, Mary Maggie. The character looks and acts like an idiot. Old Trevor from GTA 5 is shown to be attracted to the same sex, but he's also shown to be bipolar. So similar to Alfred Ashford, homosexuals are apparently mentally challenged. Next, we have a trio of bisexual characters from Metal Gear Solid, Vamp, Volgin, Rykov. Villain, villain, and villain. Oh, and this one's even a sadist.
Combo!
Speaking of winning combos, Ash from Final Fight 3, villain, and a blatant stereotype.
Monster Combo!
Shannara Seneschal is gay, obnoxious, and racist.
King Combo!
1995's The Beast Within, a Gabriel Knight mystery, not only features the longest, most boring title in gaming, but also features Baron von Glauer, homosexual villain, sexually pursuing protagonist Gabriel. He's also a werewolf, read also, a monster, inhuman.
Killer Combo!
Many of these games portray gay people at best as overly camp sidekicks to be laughed at, or ridiculously sexualized lesbians created solely for the eyes of heterosexual male gamers, and at worst, villainous psychopaths, rapists, and people with severe mental handicaps, a strangely unfounded and bizarre stereotype that has become a staple when portraying LGBT people in games. So, why is it so important for LGBT issues and characters to be included in video games? The answer is summed up perfectly in IGN's article Why We Need More Gay Characters in Games by Luke Carmali when he says, "Growing up is hard. Growing up in a world where you find it nigh on impossible to catch sight of someone you can relate to is harder." In a world where a staggering 44% of young LGBT people have admitted to suicidal thoughts, it is extremely important that something is done to assure that LGBT people are seen in a fair light and more often in our entertainment to make such an alienating experience for young people less so. Sadly, even openly gay people working in the industry think that there is little chance of LGBT people being featured in blockbuster titles. Ubisoft Montreal's lead writer, Lucien Solban, has admitted in a 2014 interview that he didn't think it was likely that big games would feature gay characters anytime soon, over developers fearing that it would impact sales. However, there is a game that arguably proves these fears are unfounded. In 2014, The Last of Us was released, a game that sold over 7 million copies before being re-released on new consoles a year later, and selling a further 1.5 million on the day of release alone. The game received much praise for its portrayal of Ellie, one of the lead characters of the game who happens to be a lesbian. Many reviews praise the subtlety of the portrayal, with the game avoiding stereotypes and overt sexualization, as many other games have been guilty of when portraying lesbian characters. With television and video games constantly coming under fire for unfair portrayals, The Last of Us, a video game, managed to portray a flawed but well-rounded and likeable gay character without referring to harmful stereotypes, proving that games are capable of surpassing other contemporary mediums in terms of writing minority characters. But the question is not if they can, but rather asking, why not more often? And would the majority of gamers actually be as offended as the heads of game companies seem to think they would be if there were more gay characters in blockbuster titles? The sales of The Last of Us would suggest not. However, one game is not enough. Even in 2016, the amount of LGBT main characters in games is minuscule and often remains in indie titles such as 2013's Gone Home on PC, which got a console release just this year. More often, in role-playing games, the option has been given to romance certain characters of the same sex, such as in Mass Effect or the Fable franchise, which is a step in the right direction. But there are few games that tell the story of an LGBT character, and as such it can leave many young people feeling alienated when they don't have characters who they can look up to personally in their games.
Getting you to the ground alive is a responsibility I can't give to anyone else. I love you.
I love you too, Steve.
Conclusively, one thing is clear. Even in our progressive age, we still live in a world that marginalises people for falling in love with someone of the same sex, or for having a different gender identity than what is considered normal. A look at the state of modern video games, one of our most popular entertainment mediums, is all one needs to see this as a problem. There are games that are moving forward, but there are still plenty that are holding them back from becoming truly evolved.
Join the Shaolin, like Kung Lao before you.
I can't. They won't accept.
They care only about what is in your heart, not whom your heart desires.